They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But when I stood in that courtroom, watching my family's faces crumble like ancient parchment, I realized it wasn't revenge I was serving. It was justice, wrapped in $5 billion and a dead grandfather's final laugh. My name is Nadia Vance, and this is the story of how I went from being the family pariah to their worst nightmare. The memory of that night still burns like acid in my veins. I was 18, standing on the marble steps of my parents' estate in Westchester County, New York, with nothing but a threadbare backpack and the clothes on my back. The February wind cut through my thin jacket as my father, Robert Vance, looked down at me from the doorway like I was something he'd scrape off his Italian leather shoes. "You've made your choice," he said, his voice as cold as the gold watch glinting on his wrist. "Don't ever come crawling back." My mother, Evelyn, stood behind him in her silk evening gown, fresh from another charity gala where she'd pretend to care about the less fortunate. The irony wasn't lost on me, even then. "Everyone has their place in this world, darling," she said, examining her manicured nails. "You simply don't fit in ours." My older brother Brandon leaned against the doorframe, smirking. "Good luck living under a bridge, Nadia. Maybe you'll finally learn what real life is like." The heavy oak door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the night. I stood there for a moment, staring at the warm light spilling from the windows, listening to their laughter drift through the glass. They were already celebrating my absence, toasting with champagne that cost more than most people's rent. That was 7 years ago. I made my way to Brooklyn, found a studio apartment above a Chinese restaurant that leaked when it rained, and got a job at a small art cafe near Pratt Institute. The work was hard, the pay was terrible, but it was mine. Every morning, #Meta, sex 0.05. I'd wake up to the sound of sirens and car horns instead of my mother's passive-aggressive comments. Every night, I'd fall asleep knowing that nobody could throw me out again. The Vance family became ghosts to me. I heard snippets through mutual acquaintances sometimes. Robert had expanded his real estate empire, buying up half of Manhattan's commercial properties. Evelyn had become president of 3 charity boards, none of which actually helped anyone except her social standing. Brandon had joined the family business, driving a different luxury car each month and dating models whose names he couldn't remember. I built my life slowly, carefully, like constructing a house of cards in a windstorm. I took night classes at the community college, saved every penny I could, learned to cook meals from YouTube videos, and discovered I had a talent for understanding people who had been broken and put back together wrong. Maybe because I was one of them. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a courier who looked like he'd stepped out of a different century. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, with my name written in fountain pen. Inside was a summons to the Harris County Courthouse in Houston, Texas, for the reading of William Vance's will. William Big Bill Vance, my grandfather. A Texas oil tycoon who'd built an empire from nothing and kept it running with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. I'd met him exactly 3 times in my life. Once at my 5th birthday, where he'd given me a $100 bill and told me to spend it wisely or foolishly, but make it memorable. Once at a family reunion when I was 12, where he'd watched me stand up to Brandon's bullying with what might have been approval in his eyes. And once, briefly, at a gas station in New Jersey when I was 19, a year after my family had thrown me out. That last meeting was strange. He'd pulled up in a pickup truck, not the Bentley I'd expected. He'd looked at me, really looked at me while I was paying for gas with crumpled dollar bills. "You're surviving," he'd said. It wasn't a question. "I'm living," I'd corrected him. He'd nodded slowly, then driven away without another word. I thought that was the end of it. Now, 6 years later, I stood in front of the courthouse in Houston, wearing my only decent outfit, a black blazer I'd found at Goodwill, wondering what fresh hell my family had planned for me. The Texas heat was already oppressive at 9 in the morning, making my clothes stick to my skin. The conference room was all dark wood and leather, the kind of aggressive luxury that whispered old money and older secrets. My family was already there, of course. Robert sat at the head of the table like he owned it, his hair more silver now but his expression just as dismissive. Evelyn had had work done, her face pulled tight in places that made her look perpetually surprised. Brandon had gained weight, his college athlete physique buried under expensive suits and excessive dinners. They looked at me like I was the help who'd wandered into the wrong room. Evelyn leaned toward Brandon, not bothering to lower her voice. "Look at her, still dressing like she shops at the Salvation Army. How embarrassing." Brandon chuckled. "Let's see what scraps the old man threw her. Maybe enough for a bus ticket back to whatever hole she crawled out of." I took a seat at the far end of the table, my hand steady despite the rage building in my chest. I'd learned to swallow anger like medicine, bitter but necessary for survival. The lawyer entered precisely at 10. Mr. Alistair Finch was older than God and twice as intimidating, with eyes that seemed to catalog everyone's sins before breakfast. He set down a leather briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and began to speak in a voice that commanded absolute attention. "We are here for the reading of the last will and testament of William Bertram Vance," he began, his words careful and measured. "Mr. Vance passed away 2 weeks ago from natural causes at his ranch in Midland. His instructions were specific. All beneficiaries were to be present for the reading." Robert shifted impatiently. "Let's get on with it, Finch. We all know how this goes. Father was traditional. Everything to the eldest son, token amounts to everyone else." Mr. Finch's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Perhaps we should simply proceed with the reading." He opened the will and began with the standard legal language, the whereas and wherefores that make lawyers rich and everyone else confused. Then he reached the meat of it. "I, William Vance, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath my entire estate, including all holdings, investments, properties, and liquid assets, estimated at $5 billion, to my granddaughter, Nadia Vance." The room went so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Robert's face turned the color of overcooked beets. Evelyn's newly tightened face managed to express shock despite the Botox. Brandon's mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air. "That's impossible," Robert finally managed. "There must be a mistake. Check again." Mr. Finch continued as if Robert hadn't spoken. "The bequest is absolute and unconditional. No trustees, no oversight, no interference from any other family members. Any attempt to contest this will or interfere with Nadia Vance's inheritance will result in the immediate forfeiture of any remaining family trusts or benefits, with those funds to be donated to the William Vance Foundation for Displaced Youth." Evelyn stood up so fast her chair tipped over. "This is insane. He was senile. That girl has no experience, no education, no capability to handle this kind of wealth." Robert's lawyer facade cracked completely. "This is fraud. We'll contest it. No judge in their right mind would uphold this travesty. Brandon, always the most direct, turned to me with naked hatred in his eyes. You manipulated him, didn't you? What did you do? Cry about being thrown out? Play the victim? I hadn't said a word since entering the room. Now I stood slowly, straightened my second-hand blazer, and looked at each of them in turn. Are you finished? I asked quietly. Mr. Finch pulled out another document. There's more. Mr. Vance left a personal letter to be read in the event of any contestation. He cleared his throat and began to read in Big Bill's voice, somehow channeling the old man's presence into the room. If you're hearing this, it means my son and his wife are showing their true colors, as I expected they would. Robert, you've spent 40 years thinking my money was your birthright, while showing none of the grit that built it. Evelyn, you married for money and raised your children to worship it above all else. Brandon, you're a pale shadow of your father, which is already saying very little. Mr. Finch paused, then continued. Nadia is the only one among you who knows the value of $1, because she's had to earn every single one. She survived your cruelty, your abandonment, your contempt, and she did it without becoming like you. That takes a strength you'll never understand. She earned this inheritance by being everything you're not. The letter went on, detailing observations Big Bill had made over the years. How Robert had tried to hide assets in offshore accounts. How Evelyn had skimmed from her charity funds. How Brandon had crashed 3 cars and had his father cover it up each time. Every sordid little secret laid bare. I leave my fortune to Nadia, not as a gift, but as a test. If she can handle you vultures trying to tear it from her, she's proven she deserves it. If not, at least it won't go to you. The room erupted. Robert shouted about lawsuits and incompetence. Evelyn shrieked about family loyalty and ingratitude. Brandon made threats that walked right up to the edge of legal assault. Through it all, I sat quietly, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. $5 billion. More money than I could conceptualize. Enough to buy the building I lived in 1,000 times over. Mr. Finch raised his hand for silence. The will has been thoroughly vetted. It's ironclad. Any attempt to contest it will only trigger the forfeiture clause. I suggest you all take some time to adjust to the new circumstances. The next few days were a blur of paperwork and threats. Robert hired 3 different law firms to find a loophole. Evelyn tried to get me declared mentally incompetent. Brandon took a more direct approach, cornering me outside my hotel in Houston. You don't deserve any of this, he snarled, blocking my path to the entrance. You're nothing. You've always been nothing. Give me my share, and I'll make sure Dad and Mom back off. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Your share? That's interesting. Tell me more about what you think you deserve, Brandon. His face went pale as he realized what I was doing. You little. I'm not little anymore, I said calmly. And you should know that Mr. Finch has already filed restraining orders on my behalf. Come near me again, and you'll be explaining yourself to a judge. He backed away, but the look in his eyes promised this wasn't over. The real battle came 2 weeks later. At the competency hearing, they'd managed to rush through a sympathetic judge. The courtroom in Lower Manhattan was packed with my family's supporters, society pages reporters, and curious gawkers who'd heard about the case. I entered wearing a new suit, properly fitted this time, bought with my own money since the estate was still in probate. Mr. Finch walked beside me, carrying a briefcase that I now knew contained enough ammunition to bury my family twice over. Robert's legal team opened with their arguments. I was unstable, they claimed, uneducated. I'd been living in poverty for 7 years, clearly unable to manage basic finances, let alone billions. They painted me as a pathetic figure who'd manipulated a dying old man. Then it was our turn. Mr. Finch stood slowly, adjusting his glasses. Your Honor, I'd like to present some evidence that speaks to the character of the contestants versus that of my client. He pulled out a digital recorder and played Brandon's threat from outside the hotel. Then bank records showing Robert's attempted fraud. Documentation of Evelyn's embezzlement from her charities. Security footage of them trying to break into Big Bill's office the day after his death, looking for the will. Furthermore, Mr. Finch continued, I have here Ms. Vance's academic transcripts from her night school courses, where she maintained a 4.0 GPA while working full-time. Letters from her employer, describing her as the most reliable employee they've ever had. Bank statements, showing that despite earning minimum wage, she managed to save 20% of her income. And character references from 37 people whose lives she's touched positively in the past 7 years. He paused, letting that sink in. Compare this to the contestants, who have been given every advantage in life and squandered them on luxury and lawsuits. Who among them has ever earned anything through their own merit? The judge, an elderly woman with sharp eyes behind thick glasses, looked at my family. Mr. Vance, Mrs. Vance, do you have any actual evidence of incompetence beyond the fact that Ms. Vance has been poor? Robert's lawyer scrambled. Your Honor, the sheer magnitude of the estate is irrelevant to the question of competence, the judge interrupted. I see no evidence of mental incompetence here. What I do see is a pattern of harassment and attempted coercion by the contestants. She turned to me. Ms. Vance, Sex, do you have anything you'd like to add? I stood up, my voice steady and clear. Your Honor, I was 18 when my parents threw me out because I didn't want to marry the investment banker's son they'd picked for me. I wanted to study art, to make my own choices, to be my own person. For that crime, I was disowned, discarded like trash. I looked at my family, meeting each of their eyes in turn. I survived. I built a life from nothing. I learned the value of work, friendship, of genuine kindness. Things they never taught me because they never knew them themselves. My grandfather saw that. He saw who they really are, and who I chose to become despite them. I pulled out a letter, Big Bill's handwriting on yellow legal paper. He gave me this at that gas station 6 years ago. He said to open it only if I ever truly needed it. I opened it the day after the will reading. I read it aloud. Nadia, if you're reading this, the wolves are at your door. Remember, money doesn't make them strong. It just reveals how weak they've always been. You walked away from their money once. That's how I knew you were the only one who could handle mine. Don't let them break you now. Not when you're so close to breaking free forever. William. The courtroom was silent. Even the reporters had stopped typing. The judge nodded slowly. The court finds no grounds for contestation. The will stands as written. Furthermore, given the evidence of harassment and coercion presented here, I'm issuing permanent restraining orders against Robert, Evelyn, and Brandon Vance. Any violation will result in immediate arrest. But I wasn't done. I turned to Mr. Finch and nodded. He stood again. Your Honor, there's one more matter. The will contains a forfeiture clause. Given the contestation and the evidence of interference we've presented, we move to execute that clause immediately. My family's lawyer jumped up. Your Honor, that's excessive. That's the law, the judge said firmly. The clause was clear. Any interference would result in forfeiture. The motion is granted. The blood drained from Robert's face as he realized what had just happened. They hadn't just lost the inheritance. They'd lost everything. The family trusts, the allowances, the safety nets that Big Bill had left them, all gone, transferred to the charity foundation. Evelyn fainted, or pretended to. Brandon had to be restrained by bailiffs when he lunged toward me. Robert just sat there, aging 10 years in 10 seconds. As I walked out of that courtroom, past the shouting reporters and flashing cameras, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 7 years. Not satisfaction exactly, not joy. It was simpler than that. I felt free. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Robert's real estate empire, built on loans backed by his expected inheritance, collapsed within months. He was investigated for fraud, convicted, and sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. Evelyn was expelled from her charity boards when the embezzlement came to light. She lost the Westchester house, the Hamptons cottage, everything. Last I heard, she was living with her sister in New Jersey, the sister she'd always called tragically middle class. Brandon lost his job when his employer learned about the restraining order and the threats. His trust fund gone, his parents broke, he had nowhere to turn. He ended up working at a car dealership in Albany, selling the same luxury cars he used to crash for fun. I used the money differently. I kept my apartment in Brooklyn for a while, needing the familiar walls while I adjusted to the surreal reality of my new life. I started the William Vance Foundation for Displaced Youth properly, funding shelters and programs for kids who'd been thrown away by their families. I knew what it felt like to be 18 and terrified, standing on a doorstep with nowhere to go. I bought a house eventually, nothing ostentatious, just a brownstone in Park Slope with good light and room for an art studio. I hired kids from the foundation to help restore it, teaching them skills, giving them jobs that paid living wages. Some of them still come by for dinner on Sundays, filling my dining room with laughter and stories of survival. Mr. Finch became my advisor and, oddly enough, my friend. He told me stories about Big Bill, about the man who'd built an empire from nothing and never forgot what nothing felt like. He saw himself in you, Finch said one evening, over whiskey that probably cost more than my old monthly rent. The fighter, the survivor, the one who refused to break. I went back to school, properly this time, studying business and art and everything in between. Not because I needed to prove anything to anyone, but because I could. Because knowledge was another form of power, and I'd learned to appreciate power that couldn't be taken away. The cafe where I'd worked hired me as a consultant when they heard about my inheritance. I helped them expand, keeping the soul of the place while making it profitable. My old manager, who'd given me shifts when I could barely stay awake from exhaustion, cried when I handed her the keys to the second location. "You don't owe us anything," she said. "That's exactly why I want to do it," I replied. I drove past the Westchester house last month. It had been sold at foreclosure, bought by a tech entrepreneur who'd gutted it and turned it into something modern and cold. The gardens my mother had paid someone to maintain were gone, replaced with a minimalist rock garden. Even the house had moved on. Brandon tried to contact me once, through a lawyer, asking for help. Just a loan, he promised. just enough to get back on his feet. I had the lawyer respond with a copy of his threat from that hotel, the restraining order, and nothing else. Some bridges, once burned, light the way forward. I think about forgiveness sometimes, late at night when the city is almost quiet. I could forgive them, I suppose. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. I could ease their suffering with what amounts to pocket change for me now. But forgiveness, I've learned, isn't about them. It's about me. And I forgave them the day I walked into that courtroom in my second-hand blazer and refused to let them make me small. I forgave them by becoming everything they said I couldn't be. I forgave them by living a life so full and rich and genuinely meaningful that their absence feels like a gift rather than a loss. The money? The money was never the revenge. The revenge was in the becoming. In the 7 years I spent building myself into someone who didn't need them, didn't want them, didn't even think about them except in passing, like remembering a bad dream that has no power in the daylight. Big Bill knew that. He didn't leave me $5 billion to punish them. He left it to me because he knew I was the only one who understood it was just paper and numbers. Powerful only in what you choose to do with it. They worshipped money. I just used it. There's a photo on my mantle now, one Mr. Finch found in Big Bill's papers. It's from my 5th birthday, the first time I met my grandfather. I'm holding that $100 bill he gave me, grinning like I'd won the lottery. But if you look closer, you can see him in the background, watching me with an expression I couldn't read as a child but understand now. He was seeing the future. He was seeing this moment, 23 years later, when his granddaughter would stand in the ruins of the family empire and build something better from the ashes. Spend it wisely or foolishly, he'd said, but make it memorable. I made it memorable, Grandfather. I made it count. Every Thursday, I volunteer at the Foundation's main shelter, serving dinner and listening to stories. These kids, thrown away by their families for being gay, trans, different, difficult, or just inconvenient. They look at me with a mixture of hope and suspicion. I recognize that look. It's the one I wore for 7 years. Last week, a girl named Amy, 17 and 2 weeks out of her parents' house, asked me how I survived it. How I made it through the anger and the hurt and the crushing loneliness of being unwanted by the people who were supposed to love you most. I thought about lying, giving her something hopeful and clean. But she deserved the truth. I didn't survive it, I told her. I was destroyed by it. Completely, utterly destroyed. But here's the secret they don't want you to know. Sometimes destruction is just another word for transformation. Sometimes being broken apart is the only way to rebuild yourself correctly. She stared at me, this girl with her thrift store clothes and determined eyes. And I saw myself at 18, standing on those marble steps in February. "It gets better?" she asked, and I heard the desperation hiding behind the question. "No," I said, and watched her face fall. "It doesn't get better. You get better. You get stronger and smarter and more capable of joy than you ever thought possible. The pain doesn't go away, but it becomes useful, like a tool you can use to build instead of destroy." I gave her my business card, my direct number written on the back. "Call me when you're ready to start building." She called the next day. She's starting college in the fall. Full scholarship from the foundation. She wants to be a social worker, to help kids like us. I told her that was spending it wisely, and she didn't understand the reference. But she will. The truth about revenge is that it's not a dish at all. It's not something you serve or consume. Real revenge is living so well, so fully, so authentically, that the people who tried to destroy you become footnotes in your story, rather than co-authors. It's looking back and realizing that their cruelty was the catalyst for your becoming, and being genuinely grateful for it. Would I be who I am if they hadn't thrown me out that night? Would I have learned to value kindness, resilience, the warmth of chosen family over the cold comfort of blood relations? Would Big Bill have seen something worth $5 billion in a girl who'd never been tested? I don't know. And that's the beauty of it. I'll never know who I would have been in their world. I only know who I became in spite of it. My name is Nadia Vance. I am worth $5 billion. I live in a brownstone in Brooklyn with good light and better memories. I have friends who would take bullets for me, and kids who call me their hero. I have scars that remind me where I came from, and hope that shows.